All right, my friends, it's time to spend some focused time looking at the Word of God like we do every week. It's an essential part of worship, and we are starting a new series on the book of Genesis. Whoa! Are you excited about that? I hope you are. I hope you're also praying for me. Today we are going to tackle Genesis chapter 1. Now, we're not going to try to tackle Genesis chapter 1 all in one go. And I'll tell you a little bit more about that as we go through the message today. We're probably going to bring most weeks some piece into the message that has to do with Genesis chapter 1 and the creation of the world, because there is a lot to talk about. There is an immense amount in Genesis chapter 1 just to talk about within the chapter itself. And then there's even a greater amount of content to talk about in how does that relate to our culture? How does that relate to science? And, what can we actually say? What can we know? What can we not know? So there is actually more to talk about than we'll ever get to in this series. It also, Genesis chapter 1 can be a divisive chapter for Christians. It can be a chapter that separates people into camps. People who think the earth is young, people who think the earth is old, people who think they're literal days, people who think they're metaphorical days. Which one is it? Now let's fight. So we're going to try not to fight with each other. I don't think anyone here will have that inclination. I don't think you will. The Good, the Bad, and the Faithful is the title of our series. And this is very important because this whole book is about who we are. And by we, I mean human beings and people who are trying to follow the God who made us, people of faith. So we're going to start out with an illustration today, then we're going to go through Genesis chapter 1 and make a few observations about it. We're going to say something today about, is it literal or is it symbolic? We're going to say something about that. And we're also going to try and pull out of Genesis chapter 1 the main point, which often gets missed because we're debating about something that's not the main point. So we'll go through that. For our illustration today, I want to try to take you back in time to before Genesis chapter 1 existed. This chapter hit the earth and the human race like a bombshell somewhere in the vicinity of 3,200 years ago, something like that. And the world has never been the same. To a very large degree, even though some people, many people in our culture, I guess, would think of Genesis chapter 1 as maybe irrelevant to us or just a myth. We'll talk about whether it's a myth or not in a few minutes. Despite that fact, it is no exaggeration to say our modern world owes, in a large degree, its existence to Genesis chapter 1. The modern world would not exist without this one piece of writing. That's true of other parts of the Bible as well, but not as much as it's true of Genesis chapter 1. Genesis chapter 1, despite the fight between people who maybe think of themselves as scientific and Genesis 1 and the difficulties there, it is the foundation for science. Crazy thing to say. Okay, our illustration to take us back before this existed, I'm going to take you through a few different creation myths that are from before Genesis chapter 1 was around. Mostly from that same region, and this will be fun, okay? I think this is going to be really fun. You're going to see just how crazy they are, and we're going to use it to compare Genesis chapter 1 and see kind of what is Genesis chapter 1. Is it a myth? Is it like the other things that our ancestors used to believe? Is it like those things, or is it something totally different? Spoiler alert, it's totally different. Okay, so first one is this, and some of these are going to be really funny, so we're going to make fun of our ancestors. If you are, except for people who are descended from maybe East Asia, almost all of us have remote ancestors from the Middle East. Almost all of us. And so a lot of these are going to be from the Middle East. We're going to go to Babylon and Samaria, which predated Babylon in the same region, and we're going to go to Egypt. This one actually is shared by many different groups around the world, and I'll show you that in a minute. And here's the myth. Okay? How did the world come to exist? It hatched from an egg. That's the myth. I'm not kidding at all, okay? Cultures around the world have different variants of this story. In some versions, there's a snake. A lot of the versions have a snake. Interesting. The snake does different things. Sometimes the snake lays the egg. Sometimes it's guarding the egg. Sometimes it's trying to destroy the egg. But where did the world come from? It hatched from an egg. Or some sort of god hatched from the egg. And then this god sort of started making other gods and making the world. But the basic idea is the same. It hatched from an egg. And here are some different places that you find versions of the cosmic egg myth. India, the Middle East, Greece, Egypt, Phoenicia, China, Finland, Polynesia, and West Africa. Whoa. Now, sometimes myths are almost always symbolic, right? And they're not, I don't even know if they were originally intended, some myths, to be believed literally. But, I mean, maybe this one sort of originated as an answer to your kids, right? That's what I think. That's why I think it originated all over the world, okay? Your kids are pestering you. Dad, where did the world come from? Mom, how did all this stuff get started? Where did we come from? You have no idea. And you have some chickens or some birds. Do you see things coming out of eggs? So you tell your kid it hatched from an egg. That's my theory on the origin of the cosmic egg myth. What do you think? Maybe? Okay. Anyway, this was super common. This is not what we would call today a serious theory about where the universe came from, is it? Because it begs a very serious question. If the world hatched from an egg, where's the chicken? How big is the chicken? Okay, or where did the egg come from, right? It just pushes off the question, doesn't it? Wow. Okay, next one. This one, we'll look at one Egyptian creation myth. And this is really remarkable. Look at this picture for a minute, and then we'll go to the myth. What do you see in the picture? Okay, you see the Sphinx. The Sphinx is probably what? What is the Sphinx? An Egyptian god, one of the Egyptian gods, a representation of one of the gods. What else do you see in the picture? A pyramid. A pyramid. Okay, remember that. There are many, and this is another feature of ancient myths for most cultures, is they didn't just have one. There were many myths, and Egypt is a prime example of this. There were a ton of different contradictory creation myths in ancient Egypt. I'm going to show you one because this one's kind of crazy, okay? This is a translation of the actual text of the Heliopolis creation myth, just the beginning of it, okay? Adam Kepler, I don't even know how to say that. This is a god, the God who created everything, that they really didn't know anything about. This is also a common feature of early creation myths. There's some great God in the background who nobody really knows anything about. You've come to be on high on the hill. What was in that picture that we just saw? A pyramid. What might be another word for a pyramid? A hill. You have arisen on the Ben stone. What are pyramids made out of? Oh, stone. A hill of stone? Ah, interesting. You spat out Shu, another Egyptian god. You expectorated, which means either coughed or sneezed out, Tefnut. And you put your arms around them as the arms of a Ka symbol, which is an Egyptian character, doesn't matter, so that your personality, your Ka, might be in them. It's a wordplay in Egyptian hieroglyphics. Weird. Took us a long time to figure that out. By us, I mean human beings, later human beings. Okay, so what's the picture here? There's some great god that nobody knows about sitting on top of a stone hill. That's why they built pyramids. That's why they built pyramids. Because they believed creation started on some big stone hill. And this God, what he does is first, they don't know anything about him other than that he spits. And he creates a god by spitting. And then he sneezes, and he creates another god by sneezing. And then those two gods, do you get what the bottom part is a euphemism for? Are you following? He's physically intimate with those two gods, and that produces more gods. And all those gods create the world like we know it. What does this myth try to communicate to us about what life is like. This is really important for understanding just how Genesis 1 should hit us, okay? Oh, my goodness. Okay, what it communicates is that life is mostly about bodily fluids, being sick, and urges. That's what it communicates. There's a lot of ideologies out there today that basically say the same thing. Life is just about bodily fluids. You're just kind of your body. And it's about, sometimes you're sick, life's really rough, and it's about your urges. Okay, one more, then we'll move on. It's taken us a little while, but this is going to be worth it, guys. This one is hilarious. I read this myth for the first time this week, and I hope you find this as funny as I do. I was laughing for probably over an hour as I read this myth. This is the Babylonian creation myth. It's on clay tablets that are currently at the University of Pennsylvania, and it is called The Debate Between Sheep and Grain. And this is a serious Babylonian creation myth about where the world came from, okay? Here's how it goes. When upon the hill of heaven and earth, notice another hill, and spawned the Anu gods, since neither spawned nor created grain, since he neither spawned nor created grain with them, with no sheep appearing, there were no numerous lambs and no goats, and there were no numerous kids. So basically, this begins with another unknown God on a hill, an unknown God on a hill, and the big problem with the world is there's no grain and there's no sheep. Okay? The world's awful because there's no grain and there's no sheep. In fact, the people of those days didn't even know about eating bread. They didn't know about wearing clothes, and they went about with naked limbs in the land. Like sheep, they ate grass with their mouths and drank water from the ditches. At that time, the place of the gods' formation in their own home, so the gods on this hill create sheep and grain. This is their amazing creation. Now, sheep also means goats, sheep and goats. It's like flocks. And they drank sweet wine, they enjoyed sweet beer. And when they had drunk sweet wine and enjoyed sweet beer, what do you think their state is at this point? They're drunk. Okay? This is the people now. The gods gave it to the people. I skipped a little bit of this. They get drunk. All the people get sweet wine and beer because now they have grain. They can make beer. They all get drunk and they start an argument in the dining hall. This is their creation story. Grain called out to sheep, "Sister, I am your better." Grain is one of their gods. Okay? "I take precedence over you. I'm the best." And sheep answers, "My sister, what are you talking about?" And most of the myth is a debate between the sheep and grain. They're just arguing over who's better. Okay? And here's how the argument goes. I'm just going to sum it up for you. Grain's argument is bread and beer, but mostly beer. This is why grain thinks he's better than, or she's better than sheep. And sheep's argument is, but clothing and meat. Come on, clothing and meat. Who do you think wins? Oh my goodness. Here's how it ends, okay? This is just absurd. This is the creation myth, okay? Enki, who's not the great unknown God, he's one of the gods that the great unknown God created. Enki speaks at the end and he says, "Sheep and grain, you should be sisters." So the best thing is if we have both sheep and grain. You guys should stand together. But of the two of you, grain is the best. Because why? Because beer. That's seriously the point of this creation myth. This is what they're learning at their temple. Grain is best because beer, okay? And then it says this, so sheep should fall on her knees before grain and let her kiss the feet of grain from sunrise till sunset. May the name of grain be praised. It ends like a Monty Python movie. Seriously. May the name of grain be praised, and people should submit to the yoke of grain. Now, we spent a long time on this. What does this myth tell us about the world? What were they teaching people? Basically, life sucks unless you got beer and you got meat. And it's best to have both of them. And then what you should do with life is eat a lot of meat and drink beer. and get drunk, and then, whoever has the grain and the meat, especially the grain, you should let them rule you. Are there philosophies like that in our world today? Oh, yeah. Oh, yeah. Okay, let's actually go to the Bible. The good, the bad, and the faithful. This series, I won't go into detail, but the reason it looks like a Wild West image is Genesis. A lot of Genesis is like the Wild West. God creates a good land, but things go bad. There's murder, revenge, power, massive destruction. A few people, later on we'll get there, a few people in faith hear the call of God. God says, leave the mess, follow me, head out west. God begins the redemption of the world with one dysfunctional family. That's what we're going into. Basically, Genesis breaks down into two parts. The book, the whole book now. Our origin, which is the first kind of 11 chapters. And then a chosen family. So the story of Abraham. Out of this huge mess of what humanity has become, God calls one person. Actually, he calls more than one, but some of those people don't answer the call. Are you answering the call in your life? And he's going to work with Abraham, even though Abraham's family is really messed up. Way more messed up than your family, for real. You'll see. The good, the bad, and the faithful. It's also, these three terms refer to three different characters or groups of people within the book of Genesis. The good is what? What does that refer to? Well, God, right? And the creation, as we'll see in a minute, the creation began, God made it good. In fact, very good. The bad is our fall from grace and basically what happens when all of humanity turns away from God. And the faithful, that's this chosen family that begins to listen to God and try, even though they mess it up over and over again, try to follow him. Okay, so now what we'll do is we're going to read all of Genesis chapter 1. Yes, okay. I'm going to read all of it. And here's what I want you to do while I read it. I want you to think about, we just heard some creation myths. I want you to think about in your head, is this like them? How is it like them? Or is it a totally different thing? Is this a creation myth? And what must it have been like to hear this for the first time? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now, the earth was formless and void, and darkness was over the surface of the deep. That's the ocean. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the waters. And God said, "Let there be light." And there was light. God saw that the light was good, and he separated the light from darkness. God called the light day, and he called the darkness night. And there was evening, and there was morning, the first day. God said, "Let there be a vault between the waters to separate water from water." So God made the vault and separated the water under the vault, that is the ocean, from the water above it, that's outer space. And it was so. God called the vault sky, and there was evening, and there was morning the second day. God said, "Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let dry ground appear." And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and gathered the waters he called seas. The gathered waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. God said, "Let the land produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and trees on the land that bear fruit with seed in it, according to their various kinds." Super important word in Genesis 1. And it was so. The land produced vegetation, plants bearing seed according to their kinds, and trees bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the third day. God said, "Let there be lights in the vault of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them serve as signs to mark sacred times and days and years. And let them be lights in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth." And it was so. God made two great lights, the greater light to govern the day, and the lesser light to govern the night. He also made the stars, and God set them in the vault of the sky to give light on the earth, to govern the day and the night, to separate light from darkness. And God saw that it was good, and there was evening, and there was morning, the fourth day. God said, "Let the waters teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the vault of the sky." So God created great creatures of the sea and every living thing with which the waters teem and move about in it, according to their kinds, every winged bird according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. I'm going to have you guys say those from now on. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful and increase in number, fill the waters in the seas, and let the birds increase on the earth." And there was evening, and there was morning, the fifth day. God said, "Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, the creatures that move along the ground, the wild animals, each according to its kind." And it was so. God made the wild animals according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that move along the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make mankind in our image, in our likeness, so that they may rule over the fish in the sea and the birds in the sky, over the livestock and the wild animals, and over all the creatures that move along the ground." So God created mankind in his own image. In the image of God, he created them. Male and female, he created them. God blessed them and said, "Be fruitful, increase in number, have some kids, people, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over the fish of the sea and the birds in the sky and over every living creature that moves on the ground." Then God said, "I give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the whole earth, and every tree that has fruit with seeds in it. They will be yours for food. And to all the beasts of the earth and the birds of the sky and all the creatures that move along the ground, everything that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food." And it was so. God saw all that he had made, and it was very good. Because now there's people. That's why it's very good. And there was evening, and there was morning, the sixth day. Thus the heavens and the earth were completed in all their vast array. By the seventh day, God had finished all the work he had been doing. So on the seventh day, he rested from all his work. Then God blessed the seventh day, and he made it holy, because on it he rested from all the work of creating that he had done. That's Genesis chapter 1 and the beginning of Genesis chapter 2. Wow. Great job. If you're still following along, if you're listening, what do you think? Is it like the other creation myths that we looked at, or is it something different? What do you think? I mean, I already told you what my answer is. The answer is that this is totally different than anything else the world had or has ever been given. It is a totally different thing. You can write this in your notes if you want. The Genesis creation story is nothing like its rivals. In fact, I spent time as I was preparing this series just trying to think about what it must have been like to read this for the first time. The Israelites, this is written down for the first time by Moses. That's almost 100% certain. It might have existed before Moses, but it wasn't written down before Moses' time. And so you've got the Israelites who had been slaves in the land of Egypt for 400 years. How many generations is that? It's a lot. They'd been slaves in Egypt, where they have creation myths like there's some unknown God that spits and coughs and does other stuff to create the world. That's really what life is all about. And then they start listening to Genesis chapter 1. Did you hear some of the things that are in there? Number one, it's the good God, the one who made everything. He's the one that we're now hearing about. It's not some other God that he made, some weird God. It's not the world came from an egg. It's actually a serious attempt to say what happened in creation. There is nothing else like it. And its meaning, which we'll get to in a few minutes, is unlike any of the other creation stories. I mean, just think in your own mind, what what kinds of things is that teaching me? Genesis chapter 1, about who I am, about who we are as human beings, about what the world is. Is it teaching me that life is all about drinking beer and eating as much as I can? Is it teaching me that life is just suffering and bodily fluids and then urges? It is so far beyond that. Do you see why I would say this creation story built the modern world? It really did. It's nothing like its rivals. In fact, it's so far different that I think you have to say, if you're honest and you compare Genesis 1 to everything else that's out there, the Genesis creation story is not a myth, which leaves us the question, what in the world is it? But it is not a myth. It is nothing like the other stuff that's out there. Oh, man. Now, when we read the Genesis creation story, we're going to spend just a couple of minutes on this today. This question often comes up, doesn't it, in our culture? How old is the earth? We're talking about the Genesis 1 creation story. There are 7 days that happen, right? And many of you will know that if you take all the genealogies in the Bible, okay, you go backwards. How long did these people live? How old were they? What does the Bible say? All the way back into the beginning of Genesis. What you come up with is about 6,000 years. So many people, many Christians think the earth is 6,000 years old. It's young. Of course, many other people, probably way more people, and some Christians think the earth is way older because the general scientific consensus would be what? How old is the earth? Anybody know? A couple billion years, something like, I don't even know. I'm not going to get into all that. I am not a scientist, though I do read about these things often, and I'm not going to try to be a scientist in any of these messages. We're not going to solve all the science in Genesis chapter 1 problems today. We're just going to look at one. We're going to look at one, and we're going to look at, is it literal or figurative, just for a couple of minutes. And then we'll get into the main point, because this is not... Is this what Genesis chapter 1 is trying to teach us? That's another question here. What do you think Moses was trying to get across when he wrote it down? You think he was trying to show us how old the world is? Now, you just read it. How old is the earth? Now, here's something that might surprise you. It doesn't say. Genesis chapter 1 does not say how old the earth is. What? Does it not? In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness was over the surface of the deep. The Spirit of God hovered over the waters. That's all before the first day. Do you see it? When Genesis chapter 1 opens, God just creates the heavens and the earth. And then the whole story in the chapter is about all the things he did on these different days. So we're not even going to get into yet. We will get into it. What are those days? Are they literal 24-hour periods? Are they something else? We'll talk about that another day. But right off the bat, we can see this doesn't tell us anything about how long the earth has actually been around. We see he created it, and then after that, the days start. It doesn't tell us how long it was that the earth was formless and empty and darkness was over the surface of the deep. No mention of it at all. This could have been for a day or a billion years, for all Genesis chapter 1 has to say about it. It actually does not say how old the earth is. Now, I don't want to just totally cop out on this question today. And so I will tell you, this is not a dogmatic thing. I actually love Pastor Bartley at our sister church, Renew, over in Toronto. He says Christians should not be dogmatic about the age of the earth because the Bible doesn't say how old the earth is. And I agree with that. This is not a salvation matter. We can disagree on this, and it's okay. Most of the time, so when I became a Christian and before that, and for a long time after, I was pretty convinced that the earth was very old, probably as old as scientists generally say that it is. Now, I would still say I'm not sure, but I probably lean toward the earth being much younger than most scientists would say that it is. I'm not going to give you all the reasons that I think that, and those aren't even that important, honestly. because everybody's going to look at this and nobody really knows. That's the truth. But I'll tell you some of those reasons as we go along, why I've come to believe it's probably a lot younger, although I don't know that I believe it's 6,000 years old, but I'm not sure. How often does a pastor stand up in front of a church and say, I'm not sure? I don't know. Let's talk for a minute about, is Genesis chapter 1 literal or symbolic? This often gets debated, and you might have heard this debated before. And I'm just going to ask you to be the judge today. We're going to look at just a couple of passages. First, let's look at a text in the Bible that is clearly literal. And part of what I'm doing here is we are teaching you how to study the Bible. Okay? There are different parts of the Bible that are written in different ways. And the best way to figure out stuff about the Bible, what do you think the best way to figure out what the Bible means and if it's literal or figurative is? Do you think it's to watch a YouTube video? Who thinks that's the best way to figure out if a Bible passage? How about read a book about the Bible? Anybody think? How about flip a coin? Is that the best way to figure out if it's... How about looking at the actual Bible? That's the best way. This is super important for how we approach Scripture. You should be reading the Bible and not just listening even to what Pastor Isaac has to say. You should be thinking about the text for yourself. That's actually what the Bible tells you to do with it. Read it for yourself. Think about it. Ask God about it. Wrestle with it. So let's look at a text that's clearly literal. And you'll see what I mean when this is just a random text from later in Genesis. Okay? This text is clearly literally true. It's a story. It's history. Abram went up from Egypt to the Negev with his wife and everything he had, and Lot went with him. Abram had become very wealthy in livestock and silver and gold. From the Negev, he went from place to place until he came to Bethel, to the place between Bethel and Ai, where his tent had been earlier. And where he had first built an altar, there Abram called on the name of the Lord. Then he spent some time talking with his cousin Lot, or his nephew Lot. Okay? And they decide they can't stay together because they have too much stuff. They have too many sheep. It's a good problem to have. We heard from the Babylonians. They have too many sheep, so they can't stay together. Okay? They're super rich. Now, is that text literal or symbolic? It's obvious, isn't it? Right? It's clearly literal. It's just a story. It's like if I told you about somebody walking down the street and going shopping and going to the mall and went home and whatever they did. It's just a description of something that happened. Clearly literal text, right? Now, don't answer this question yet. Is Genesis chapter 1 like this? Just think about that for a minute. Is it like this? Let's look at a text that is clearly symbolic. There are some texts in the Bible that are very obvious that there's symbolism. One thing stands for something totally different. Here we go. This one's from Revelation chapter 12. A great sign appeared in heaven, a woman clothed with the sun. What? With the moon under her feet, and a crown of 12 stars on her head. Somebody want to draw me a picture of that? Get artificial intelligence to generate that. She was pregnant and cried out in pain as she was about to give birth. And then another sign appeared in heaven, an enormous red dragon with 7 heads and 10 horns and 7 crowns on its head. Its tail swept a third of the stars out of the sky, flung them to the earth. The dragon stood in front of the woman who was about to give birth so that it could devour her child the moment it was born. She gave birth to a son, a male child, who will rule the nations with an iron scepter. Her child was snatched up to God and to his throne. Is this literal or symbolic? I mean, it's probably obvious to any honest person. The Bible is not saying there's going to be a giant dragon that appears in the sky, right? And it's going to chase this pregnant woman who's in the desert. That's not what the Bible is saying. Okay, the woman actually represents the people of God, first the Jewish nation and then the church. The child to be born is whom? It's Jesus. The dragon represents what? Satan. And this is all about the battle. It's all a symbolic representation of the battle between Satan and God and the church. Okay? So there's a clearly symbolic text. Let me ask you this. Don't answer yet. Is Genesis chapter 1 like this? I see some heads shaking. it's not like this. It's not. Some people really, really want Genesis chapter 1 to be symbolic, and it's not quite like the story of Abram that we just read. It's not quite as easy to picture as somebody was going around the desert with his sheep, but it's not like this. The stuff in Genesis chapter 1 does not represent something different than what's being described. When it talks about the earth, it means the earth. When it talks about the sun, it means the sun. It is not symbolic. So what in the world is it? Okay, let's skip through some of this. Skip to my next point, or my next section. Okay, here's what I'm going to say about Genesis chapter 1. It is literal, and it's written like a song or a poem. That's the best way I could come up with for today to describe it to you. We might come up with different ways on future days. It is clearly literal, but it also is not just a story about something some guy went and did in the desert one day. It repeats itself a number of times. It has elements that are clearly, if you were to think of another book of the Bible that kind of sounds like Genesis chapter 1, any ideas? Some parts of the Bible that kind of have that same repeating things and a kind of a rhythm to them. You might think of the book of Psalms, right? Which we did in the summer, and which is a bunch of songs that the Hebrews actually sang. The Israelites actually sang those in worship. Now, I don't think Genesis chapter 1 was something that was sung, but I do think it was something that was recited out loud by a whole community. And it's written in such a way that they could do that. It's written in such a way that they could do that. It's literal, but it's also written like a song or a poem. All right. Let's just run through and we'll see what the main point is, and we can wrap this up, and hopefully you will see just how much of a bomb this was that was dropped on the earth. Not a bad bomb, though. I mean, just something that was so dramatic when it hit the human race that it changed the future history of the world. Looking for the main point. And this is another place where we can teach, we can say, what are we doing when we come to study the Bible? How old the earth is, and whether it's symbolic or literal, those aren't even the main point of the Bible. Those are things we often get distracted by. Have you ever been talking to someone and telling them a story, and suddenly you realize that they're not really listening to your main point? They're just interested in like one little side point that you said, because maybe you're telling them about your summer vacation, and you said something about soccer, and they're really into soccer, and the only thing they heard was soccer. Have you ever had an experience like that? Their eyes kind of glaze over the rest of the time. A lot of times that's what we do with the Bible. We only listen, or our ears only perk up about the things we're interested in. Like, oh, how old is the earth? What do these days really mean? And sometimes we miss the main point of the text. Now, we're not going to go back and read the whole thing again because we don't have time, so I'll just refer back to it again. But let's finish today with a few things that are the main point. This is the main point of Genesis chapter 1, and a few subpoints to this, okay? The main point of the text is that the one true God is actually good, and He created everything for a purpose. Compare that to the other creation myths we looked at. Imagine you had grown up in a society where you were a slave, and you would always be a slave, and you were taught that what life was about is bodily fluids, being sick, fulfilling your urges, and drinking as much beer as you can, because that's the only way you're going to get through how much life is terrible. Imagine that was your whole existence, and you'd never known that even another existence was possible. And this is what the gods of your society said life was like. And then you read Genesis chapter 1. God looked at the world, and He made it good. What's your sense of how did God feel as He was creating in Genesis chapter 1? I kind of tried to give you a sense of what I think it is. I think He was so excited as He's making everything. He's overflowing with love and joy and happiness as he creates all these different things on the earth and people and hey, go, multiply, rule the earth. And then you read in Genesis chapter 1, you've grown up as a slave, and you read that God, the one God who made the whole universe, created you in his own image. You're made to be like him. Another point, a sub-point we can draw out of this, the creation is good. Life is so hard that most people groups in most of history have thought life is just suffering. Life is just, how do I get through it? In fact, Buddhism, when it first started, that was its main tenet. Life equals suffering. That's what it is. The creation is good. It is fundamentally good. Let there be light. There is order in creation. Most people in most of history, most people groups have thought that the world was just random. Things just happen, it's chaos, we can't even figure out why. In Genesis chapter 1, you see God, he separates things. He creates days, he creates structure, he creates organisms, plants and animals according to particular kinds. The world makes sense. It is logical, it is structured, it has boundaries. You can interact with it in a way that makes sense. Could you do science if this weren't true? If the world were really just random, science wouldn't exist at all. This is the foundation of the entire scientific worldview. It came from Genesis chapter 1. Finally, God created you for a purpose. All your life, you grew up as a slave in Egypt. And now you read this text that says you were created with a mission. You're supposed to rule the world. You're supposed to go have children and raise godly children who can fill the earth with good things. You're supposed to take care of everything that's been given. You're supposed to become like God. You have a purpose. Life is not meaningless, and you are not an accident. Genesis chapter 1 changed the world. Oh man, there's so much more to talk about. Should we go for 2 more hours? I hear that's what they do in some countries or some churches. No, we'll pass on that today. Let's pray, and we'll come back to Genesis chapter 1, and we'll jump into chapter 2 again next week.